just maybe 2 more minutes before we start our meeting tonight. So just want to go ahead and just give a little bit of announcement about the CAG. And I don't know if any of you know or not, but we do have a YouTube page. So I'm going to put the link to our YouTube page so that we can see our meetings and be able to revisit them if we missed something. Please go to YouTube and give us a thumbs up, and also subscribe to the channel so you can get an alert when we post a new video. I'm also going to put in the chat to our website. So I'm going to put our website and our YouTube link in the chat here.
Also, Michael, I noticed that the record button has been selected. So just so that participants know that this meeting is being recorded.
That's right. We are recording this evening, so just so everyone is aware of that.
Michael, would you like me to go back through one more time on Zoom?
Let's do one more time. It looks like people are still populating, so we want to make sure everyone gets the message. So yeah, let's do it one more time here.
Okay, yeah, it looks like we've got 54 people in the room, so that's great. Okay, so we're going to go through one more time on how to navigate a Zoom meeting. For those of you that have been through this a couple times, you're welcome to explore some of the finer controls using your panel. So if you're using an iPhone, you've got a mute button. You also have, and that's in the far left corner, you also have a stop or start video button. If you need to share content, whether you're using a PC or an iPhone, that would be this green upload button. And if you want to see a list of participants, clicking on this will allow you to see that list. The controls are less, they present less controls in phones just because it's a smaller screen. You'll see more controls on a PC. And here we are shifting over to what it looks like on a PC. Notice in the far left, you still have the mute unmute button, but it also gives you an option with an up arrow. And this up arrow allows you to select which microphone you want to use, if you have multiple options for that, or which speaker you want to listen through. And there's also some other finer settings you can set. Start and stop videos, same way. Click, unclick, and your video will stream in accordance. List of participants. If you click on this, it will pull up a list of who are the participants are, and you can see who the community is that's joining. Same with the chat, but in the case of the chat, if you click, it does give you the opportunity to select names. Now this is, of course, because I was in a room by myself when I made this, but notice on yours right now, if you look, you'll see that there are many people in the room. And if you use the down arrow here, you can select a name and say hello to someone. And since this is a kind of a networking time, go ahead and just do that and say hello to somebody, or you can send a message to the room. And then there's reactions. I noticed that some people have already used the reaction button, but somebody says something you like, or maybe you want to express a more complex emotion, select from one of the emoticons. And then finally, if you have need to leave the meeting, that's how you do it, is by clicking that button in the bottom right-hand corner. And finally, if you're on a platform that is not the same as either a PC or an iPhone, then your controls will use these standard icons that are used across every platform. This, you recognize this is the chat, mute, unmute, start video, share content, participant list. All right, Michael.
Okay, all right. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us again tonight on our monthly CAG meeting. We're going to go ahead and start off our meeting this evening. First, I want to introduce Sarah Taylor, who's going to give us a land acknowledgement, and then she's also going to give us a little bit of a brief history about the Willamette River. I think she's going to be using some maps to kind of show us this here as well. And then I will be introducing folks to our guest speakers after Sarah. All right, Sarah, you can unmute and go ahead and unmute. There you are.
Okay, I think I'm ready.
Okay.
Okay, good evening, everyone. As some people know, I like to try to write a land acknowledgement that I think goes with our topic or with the current time. So here's my attempt on this evening. We gather here tonight with a collective determination to heal, repair, and restore the lower Willamette River watershed, its waters, land, natural resources, and wildlife in acts of commitment and stewardship for future generations. We acknowledge the villages of the Chinook people who lived on Sobeys Island, the Willamette Channel, St. John's, and the Columbia Slough. We acknowledge the relationships with the many lakes, streams, wetlands, and plant communities on both sides of the river. We acknowledge the first foods of this region, the vast resources that fed and cared for the people for thousands of years. We acknowledge the many tribes that traveled to the Willamette River to fish and gather and trade. We acknowledge the treaties that assured them the right to these first foods, as we also acknowledge our government's collective and ongoing failure to honor these treaties. With compassion and understanding, we acknowledge the introduced diseases that caused untold suffering and death on the shores of this river. We acknowledge the unimaginable grief of mothers and fathers as we too grieve in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Tonight, we acknowledge the disproportionate toll the COVID pandemic has had on Indigenous communities in our state and in our nation. We acknowledge the systemic racism that leads to disproportionate health, economic, and educational impacts for generations to come. We acknowledge our power to dismantle systemic racism and environmental injustices, no matter how difficult it seems, no matter how often we falter. We acknowledge with awe and gratitude this watershed's natural ability to cool the earth, to replenish the soil, to manage floods, prevent wildfires, and provide natural resources for all living things. We have witnessed the earth's ability to heal and repair itself and look forward with joy to this unfolding process in the lower Willamette. With this, we open our eyes and hearts and commit to listen and learn from this place, the confluence of two great rivers, the place we call home, knowing that our decisions, our words, and our actions will impact other rivers, other communities, and our planet.
Thanks for that, Sarah. And so now Sarah's going to give us a brief history of the Willamette River.
It's some geography.
Geography? Sorry about that.
So Scott, are you going to put those share screens for me, or am I going to try? Scott?
I'll do that for you.
Okay, I want the first one I want is the 1859 one, or the yeah, just the regular, the whole map. I don't quite see it, but can people see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yes, I can see it.
I can't quite see it. Okay. I just wanted to share some old maps with people today. There's lots of times when I enjoy history, but today is just kind of a geography with this old map that is an 1852 survey map. And because we're talking about restoration, I thought it would be fun to see what this river looked like back in 1852. And as you can see, it is considered a braided river. It is a tidal river in that the tides rise and fall, and it floods every spring. And in the old journals, they called that the spring freshet, when the water was very high. And so when they were measuring the depth of the river, it would be dramatically different if they were measuring in the spring or in the fall. I love to point out that there were so many islands, and we'll see some other maps of some islands, but you can see islands. You can see that there were many, many lakes as you go down. You see on the west side, Giles Lake, you see Doan Lake, Kittredge Lake. And if you look, the little dotted lines are all the many streams that are flowing into the area. Okay, let's go to the next map, which would be the confluence map. You see that, Scott?
Is that the, is it the mouth of the Willamette?
Yeah, the mouth. I can't really see it, so I'm just kind of doing this from what I remember. But what I love about this map, these maps were made by the US Navy, and they came down from Vancouver, Fort George, and they came to, they came down from Astoria to Fort Vancouver, and they said, we're gonna see what the depth of this river is. And that was their job. And they brought some big ships that could go into the Columbia River, but they were, they couldn't go into the Willamette River. It wasn't deep enough. So they ended up taking a flatboat and measuring the depths. And that's what you see here are these old maps from when they first measured the depth of the river. And you can see these islands. And the fun thing about these islands, besides Sauvie's Island, is that they blocked the mouth of the Willamette. So there's the famous kind of story that Lewis and Clark, when they were going west, and then when they were going back east, they kept missing the Willamette River. And that's because there were those islands. Now, right now, all we have is Sauvie's Island. Kelly Point was its own island. And what happened is that they were all filled in so that those islands were kind of made to join the mainland. So anyway, kind of fun, lots of little islands that I'm sure were used for many things for thousands of years. When settlers came, they named them after themselves. And we're just looking at geography tonight, but many, many spirited stories about those islands that I might tell you another time. Okay, let's look at the Swan Island map. So here's Swan Island when it was an island. As you know, it was filled in, and that was called the Clay Bluffs, I believe, in that map. And it was filled in so that there was no longer the channel all around. The numbers that you see are the depth, and there was a lot of sandbars, and actually Swan Island, which was called Willow Island, was one of the biggest deterrents towards, getting a big boat down the river, because it had a large sandbar, had the post office sandbar, which they said even in the biggest rainy season was only 5 feet deep.
Sarah,
Yeah.
are the numbers in feet or fathom?
Fathom. So that would be 3 feet.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you would do a little math. They said that it might say feet sometimes, but I think it's mostly fathom. And this was in the spring. They did this survey in May, so it would have been a lot less at another time of the year. And they were quickly figuring out that this wasn't going to be a port that was going to be able to have ships that needed deep water. Cooch, famous, we have a lot of things named after Cooch. He came here and he likes to say that the river was only 5 feet deep and that he could ride a horse across the river. So that's another indication of what it was like then. Okay, do we have another one, Scott? This is the post office bar, which we already talked about a little bit. Okay, how about, is there one more? I don't think so, maybe not.
Post
The
office.
post office bar, which I believe is one of the cleanup sites, is the post office bar. I could not find, maybe somebody else knows why it's called the post office bar, but it was a major challenge and one of the first things that they tried to dredge. And as early as 1879, they petitioned to begin dredging all of this so that there would be a channel. At the time, they asked that it be 20 feet. And they said that there was a lot of money all over the United States to dredge, and Portland got some of that dredging money. I didn't realize this, they tried to keep up with the Panama Canal. So when the Panama Canal was 40, then they kept going deeper and deeper to match the Panama Canal. But originally, as I hope you can see from these maps, it was a very shallow river with lots of islands, lots of lakes, and lots of streams and lots of wetlands. They believed that the floodplain was about 8 miles wide. So, and as we know that that as much as that frustrated people who came to the Willamette Valley to make a fortune, the area had provided a good livelihood for people for many years. But anyway, these are just some fun maps I found, and I thought they might be fun to look at before we talk about restoration. So thank you.
That's all we.
Wow.
Thank you, Sarah. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. That was great. Thanks for sharing those. It just goes to show how our river has changed, our city has changed, and nothing stays the same. So the possibilities for change is always there, and really grateful for you for doing the work on that there. So just there's one little disruption before we introduce our guest tonight. We do have Caleb Schaefer, who is EPA's Superfund team lead. He's going to give us a quick update on some remedial design signatures. Hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about Cathedral Park and any other news that's coming down the pike. So Schaefer will briefly kind of get us up to date real quick.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for having me here tonight. I will be very quick, just some updates though to share with the group. And Laura, I believe, is going to quickly try and screen share our map, but I'll go ahead and get into it. Just in terms of remedial design, just to touch upon a couple points, remedial design continues. We're moving ahead primarily in the pre-design investigation phase. We will be announcing Friday via a formal press release that the Swan Island Basin area is under an agreement. And I know with many of this group, we've shared that we signed that agreement recently. We will be publicly announcing that via a press release. And part of that is also an announcement saying that we now have 100% of all of these project areas in the remedial design phase, meaning we're moving them forward actively towards cleanup. The other area I'll just touch upon briefly is Cathedral Park, just because it's obviously an area of interest, and we continue to move forward in planning for remedial design and planning specifically for sampling to occur in likely summer of this year, which will be forming a working group and have a lot more coordination on that. So stay tuned for further information on that. So that is a very quick, broad stroke of remedial design activities. And then a couple other very quick just announcements of upcoming activities. We have this Friday is we have our first coffee hour. So it's an EPA coffee hour, and the intent behind this was to the audience is intended for community members primarily, to get to know some of the EPA project managers working on these remedial designs and overseeing them. So we are going to bring 2 of those remedial project managers to each one of these coffee hour meetings. The first one is this Friday from noon to 1. And the first 2 project managers that will be attending and available for folks to come and ask questions will be Mady Novak, who is the lead for the Swan Island area that I just mentioned, as well as River Mile 7 West, the Arkema Bear area, as well as Hunter, who's on the line in the meeting tonight as well. And he's the lead for the B1A Linton area, Gasco US Moorings Nav Channel, River Mile 11 East, and some small unassigned areas that we're taking the lead on. So encourage folks that are interested in that to reach out to Laura. Will put her contact information in the chat, and we encourage community members to participate in that to ask questions and get to know some of our project managers more. And then finally, just also want to quickly mention that our first Portland Harbor Collaborative meeting will be happening on March 10th. So certainly please mark your calendars for that. I'm looking forward to launching that effort, which a lot of planning of many of the people on the line tonight have been engaged in and invested a lot of time in. Laura, anything else on the collaborative you want to mention to the group?
Thanks, Caleb. Just very quickly, it will be March 10th in the evening and probably 4:30 to 8, and we'll be sending more information about that soon. But just to clarify too, that this is, EPA and DEQ are working together to co-convene this collaborative group, which will be replacing the quarterly public forums that we've had up till now. But the idea for this group came from community leaders. A lot of people on this call worked really hard on it, like Caleb said, and it really is, their group. So Triangle Associates, who one of my colleagues, Lucila, is on today, is conducting most of the outreach, and will be doing the facilitation of that group. So Lucila will put in the email. If you are interested at all in joining this group or participating, we'd love to hear from you. Triangle would love to hear from you, and you can email them and they can share additional information. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, all right. Okay, so without any further ado, I would like to introduce everyone to Lauren Sinker. Lauren is with NOAA, and she'll be discussing habitat restoration on the Willamette River and in the Portland metro area. And also we'll be, talking about some connections between restoration projects and identifying what's happening within our river system. So without any further ado, we'll go ahead and bring Laura on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. Happy to be here. Let me see if I can figure out the screen sharing bit. Can you all see my presentation?
It looks great.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it looks good.
Perfect. So yeah, I'm Lauren Sinker. I'm a habitat restoration specialist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, with NOAA's Restoration Center. And I lead the restoration committee for the Portland Harbor Natural Resource Trustee Council. And so the topic of my presentation here that Michael and others have asked me to give is just an update on restoration that's happening under the trustee council's work in Portland Harbor, and a little just preview of what to expect here today. The slides that I have prepared, I tried to include a lot of visuals, so it's interesting to look at, but there's this PowerPoint to guide us. And I have sort of a brief history of Portland Harbor, just to provide a little bit of context. Although the history and some of the maps that Sarah pulled up earlier, I think they fit really well with some of the stuff that I'll cover too. And I'm then going to provide a little bit of an overview about who the Portland Harbor Trustee Council is and what the natural resource damage assessment process that we are engaged in is all about, and how it links up with other things happening in Portland Harbor, like cleanup and other efforts going on. And then the vast majority of what I'll talk about is going to be restoration planning and restoration progress. And then I'm hoping to save plenty of time for questions and hopefully answers for your questions. So to jump right in, I did want to start with a little bit of history of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers and the importance of the Portland Harbor area. This confluence area has long been central to the lives and traditions and economies of the people who live here. It has been a place of gathering and natural resource use for millennia by the tribes that have depended on this area. It's a place of abundant fresh water and fish and wildlife. It's long served as a transportation corridor and as a trading center, as it continues to do today. And this map I've always enjoyed looking at. There's others like it floating around there. This one I think I borrowed from the city of Portland. It's in a neat Willamette River Atlas that they published some years ago, but it's a side-by-side comparison of what the lower Willamette River looked like back in 1888 versus in 2001. And let me hide that little thing so you can see the graphics a little better. But even by 1888, I mean, by the mid 1800s, you know, thousands and thousands of settlers had already come to the Portland area and started modifying the landscape. But back then you can see some of the similar features that Sarah was pointing out in some of the maps she pulled up just a moment ago. You know, braided river channels, lots of off-channel habitats and lagoons and sloughs and ponds. You know, a very different mix of habitat types and a different type of river than what we see nowadays, which is a really channelized, deepened and dredged single thread of the Willamette River that moves through downtown Portland. And so thinking of these historic habitat types and the natural resources that depend on these habitat types, these are some of the things that we keep in mind as we're planning and implementing habitat restoration in the lower Willamette. And more recently in the history of Portland Harbor, as you are all pretty well aware, I'm sure, in the year 2000, Portland Harbor was declared a Superfund site by EPA due to the threats to human health and the environment that have been caused by the contamination that are left in Portland Harbor by past industrial use. And in 2002, the Trustee Council formed. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the Trustee Council here. The Portland Harbor Natural Resource Trustee Council is a collection of 5 tribes and 3 government agencies. The 5 tribes include the Grand Ronde, Nez Perce, Siletz, Umatilla, and Warm Springs. And the government agencies involved include NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who I work for, as well as the U.S. Department of the Interior, another federal agency, and then a state agency, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And together, the Trustee Council is conducting a natural resource damage assessment. And our goal, our mission together is to assess how natural resources and ecological services have been injured by contamination in Portland Harbor over time, to develop a plan to restore or rehabilitate or replace those injured natural resources and services, and then to seek compensation from the parties that are responsible for the contamination. And this process, natural resource damage assessment, is independent of the cleanup and of the remedy. The cleanup and the remedy are led by EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and DEQ, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, as you guys are well aware and speak and meet with them very regularly. And then what the trustee council's purview is overseeing the restoration, determining how much injury occurred and then how much restoration is needed to compensate for that injury. And these graphics are just meant to show how sort of the EPA piece in the top graphic is focused on, cleaning up the contamination, whereas the trustee council's work is focused on restoring the lost uses and lost services to natural resources in the same area that were caused by that contamination. And as you guys are, I'm sure, well aware, these are some of the contaminants that we're most concerned about. The trustee council's interest and kind of angle in looking at the impacts of these contaminants is understanding how they have impacted the success of fish and wildlife in Portland Harbor, also how they've impacted recreation and cultural use. And so we have been, for years now, assessing all of those different services. And thus far, we're mainly focused on restoration for ecological purposes, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment here. So some of the natural resources that we're most focused on and that we believe were potentially injured by the contamination in Portland Harbor are fish like salmon and lamprey and sturgeon, birds like bald eagle and osprey, mammals such as mink, and then other natural resources like the water and sediments and soils, as well as invertebrates, the little critters that live there in the sediments. So the trustee council is conducting a natural resource damage assessment, and the purpose of the assessment is to identify and quantify injuries caused by the release of hazardous substances and discharges of oil in Portland Harbor. We are doing this through a phased approach. The first phase was development of our assessment plan, which we completed many years ago. That assessment plan is available on our website. The second phase is an expedited settlement-oriented damage assessment that we're currently engaged in and that we have been engaged in for about a decade now. The third phase is to complete a full assessment, and then the fourth phase is going to be recovery of damages from parties that did not settle with us in phase 2 in this expedited settlement-oriented effort that we're currently engaged in. And that phase 4 will probably involve taking those entities who have not settled with us to court. So the second phase, the settlement-oriented damage assessment, is nearing completion. We have quantified or qualitatively characterized natural resource injuries and lost services through a simplified, expedited cooperative assessment process with a subset of the potentially responsible parties from Portland Harbor. And we are engaged in and trying to facilitate settlements with those potentially responsible parties. Another recent accomplishment that I wanted to share and highlight is that we just recently published our draft supplemental restoration plan. We published it back in August and had a public comment period that was open into September. And we plan to finalize it sometime in the next month or so. We'll be publishing the final document. And this final supplemental restoration plan is guiding how the trustee council is going to manage settlement funds for ecological injuries that we have assessed as part of this phase 2 process. And so it is telling the public how we are going to spend the settlement funding that we receive from these phase 2 settlements to gain ecological benefit for natural resources and services. And so just to dive a little bit more into the supplemental restoration plan, it picks up where our 2017 programmatic environmental impact statement and restoration plan left off, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in just a moment. But it's basically a supplement to this much larger document. In the supplemental restoration plan, we have determined that the restoration bank credit alternative is our preferred alternative. We also provide an update about the natural resource damage assessment process. And we identify 5 eligible restoration bank projects that are eligible to sell credits under this restoration bank credit alternative that we've identified as our selected alternative. And the document also assesses environmental impacts of the preferred alternative. So it's also an environmental assessment. It's a NEPA document as well as a restoration plan. And like I mentioned just a moment ago, that supplemental restoration plan, it tiers to this programmatic restoration plan and environmental impact statement that we published back in 2017, which provided much of the foundation for what we're doing for restoration under the Trustee Council's work. That programmatic restoration plan identified our overall restoration approach, which we call integrated habitat restoration planning. So the approach we've taken to restoration is to try to restore habitat types and ecological processes that serve multiple species that we believe have been injured in Portland Harbor. So we're not trying to implement one salmon project over here and then one bald eagle project over there, but instead trying to restore a mosaic of habitats and habitat features that support all of those species. So integrated habitats and integrated restoration. Within this programmatic restoration plan, we also laid out a framework for how that integrated habitat restoration would be implemented. Things like the types of monitoring, the number of years of monitoring, and how long-term stewardship would occur on these sites. All those kind of big picture framework things were laid out in the document, though no individual restoration projects were identified in this programmatic restoration plan. The individual projects have now been identified in that supplemental restoration plan that I was talking about just a moment ago. And then this larger document was also a NEPA document, and it's where we conducted a broad analysis of some of the environmental impacts associated with the integrated habitat restoration alternative. So to just talk in a little bit more detail about what our ecological restoration goals are. This first slide of goals are really our kind of program level goals. So we need to meet our obligations under the law and restore, replace, rehabilitate, or acquire the equivalent of the natural resources and services that were injured as a result of the contamination in Portland Harbor. We need to compensate the public for injuries to their natural resources and the services that those resources provide. And we're trying to provide diverse, sustainable habitat types within Portland Harbor to enhance fish and wildlife resources. More specifically, and kind of honing more in on our ecological restoration objectives, we're also trying to move towards more normative hydrology, restore floodplain function, reestablish floodplain and riparian plant communities, improve aquatic and riparian habitat conditions, improve river margin habitat, so increase the complexity and access to the habitat types that are right there on the edges of the river, which are particularly important to juvenile salmonids, one of our target species. And we're trying to restore habitat that provides ecological value in a landscape perspective. So looking at larger patch sizes and how these sites can really contribute to the ecological value of the area. And I wanted to take a little step back and talk about some of the early restoration planning that the Trustee Council did, just to provide a little context for how we've ended up where we are with the 5 projects that we identified as eligible under the supplemental restoration plan that we recently published. So back in about, I don't know, the 2008 to 2012 timeframe, we facilitated a community-based process to identify potential restoration projects in Portland Harbor and in a broader focus area that we've identified for restoration. So we years ago convened an expert panel to help us understand the species that we're most interested in restoring habitat for in Portland Harbor. What nearby habitats or areas do they also depend on that we could also restore habitat in to still benefit them? We wanted to make sure that any restoration we do would have a nexus to the species and the life stages that were actually injured here in Portland Harbor. And so with their help, we identified this area in red. I'm not sure if you guys can see my arrow, but the red area in the map is what we call our broader focus area for restoration. And it extends along the main stem of the Willamette River from Willamette Falls down to the confluence of the Willamette River with the Columbia River. It also includes Multnomah Channel all the way down to Scappoose Bay, and then it includes the Oregon side of the Columbia River from Scappoose Bay over to West Hayden Island. And a portion of West Hayden Island is also included. So that's the geographic area that we've identified where restoration can take place for the natural resource damage assessment. And we have a policy requiring that at least half the restoration will occur in Portland Harbor itself, so within the yellow area in this map, and then no more than half the restoration will occur in the red area, in the broader focus area. So to figure out what restoration projects might meet our goals and were opportunities out there, we sought input from the community. We sent out a call for projects and reached out to watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts and local governments, nonprofits, and individuals, and said, we're looking for restoration projects that meet these various objectives. Here's the kind of information we'd like to know about them. And all in all, we received about 60 projects for consideration. We screened those projects against criteria that we developed that were largely based around salmon and lamprey and sturgeon, mink, bald eagle, and osprey. But also included social and feasibility criteria to kind of assess the likelihood of implementation and costs and some of those considerations. We screened those projects, and then we came up with this list of 44 projects that we published in what we call our ecological restoration portfolio. And that portfolio is available on our website. It's something that if we've met in the past from previous CAG meetings or other public events that I may have seen you at, we always kind of have a copy of this with us. So many of you have probably seen it. But we identified these 44 projects, and we would then use them as examples of the types of restoration that we would hope we could accomplish through the natural resource damage assessment process. And this was never to say that we expected that all of these projects would be implemented or that all these projects would be implemented through the natural resource damage assessment. It was really to provide examples and to help understand the availability of restoration opportunity, especially in Portland Harbor itself, but also to then lead potentially responsible parties who wanted to settle with us to figuring out how they could settle and what kinds of projects would actually meet our ecological objectives. And ahead of this meeting, Michael had shared with me some questions that it sounded like parts of your group had about restoration and about work that the trustee council might be doing in various parts of the river. And some of the terminology that he was using seemed to harken back to the City of Portland River Plan from several years ago, where they identified the North Reach, the Central Reach, and the South Reach, and then identified a lot of restoration opportunities within those areas. And the city's North Reach plan did serve as the basis of our ecological restoration portfolio early on. That is where we kind of first looked to understand what restoration opportunities might be out there. And as you'll see when I talk a little bit more later about restoration implementation and restoration progress to date, 3 of the 4 restoration projects that have moved forward and have been implemented thus far are in the North Reach. And the 4th project is down at the southern end of our broader focus area outside of the Central or South Reach, so further south than the City of Portland's river plan reaches included. So I did want to clarify that at this particular time, though we have projects identified in the Central Reach and in the South Reach and other projects along Multnomah Channel or along the Columbia River, we don't currently have any active projects in those other areas. Our only active projects are these 4 that I'll show you and describe in more detail in just a little bit. And here they are. So in this map, these are the 5 restoration bank projects that in our recent supplemental restoration plan, we determined are eligible to sell credits either to potentially responsible parties or to the trustee council for use of settlement funds through the Portland Harbor Natural Resource Damage Assessment process. So those projects are Alder Creek, the Linton Plywood site, Miller Creek, and PGE's Harborton wetlands. Those first four are all within Portland Harbor itself and really on the north and western side of the Portland Harbor area. And then the fifth project we've determined as eligible is the Rainierson Creek Natural Area, which is, like I mentioned earlier, south of the South Reach, really at the southern end of our broader focus area. It's this lone green star on the bottom half of our map. And of these 5 projects, all but the Miller Creek project have already been implemented. And I'll dive into some more detail on each of those in just a minute. But the Miller Creek project is still conceptual at this time. The other 4 projects are, they've been implemented, they've been constructed, and we've worked very closely, the trustee council has worked very closely with the project implementers to provide technical assistance to help make sure that their projects were able to meet the ecological goals that we have, the monitoring frameworks, the stewardship objectives, all the various pieces that we've outlined in our programmatic restoration plan. And I did want to take just a second to talk a little bit more about what restoration banks are and what some of their benefits are. So all 4 of those projects that have been implemented, Alder, Linton, PGE, and Rainierson, are operating as restoration banks, which means that they have been built prospectively by an entity that is trying to sell credits from their project, sell the ecological value of their project to the potentially responsible parties from Portland Harbor. And by building these projects, they're able to restore larger tracts of land and larger ecological, more ecological value than what an individual potentially responsible party might be able to do. So previous to this, what we've seen happen in other kind of complex multi-party Superfund sites like Portland Harbor is that, sometimes one PRP would implement a project over here and then another potentially responsible party would implement another one over there. And you'd get these small postage stamp sized projects that were disconnected and, provided value, but small value with a lot of edge effects and without a lot of connectivity between the habitats. And by pooling the liability that different potentially responsible parties have into one large project, these restoration banks are able to restore larger tracts of land and more ecological process and ecological value than those small projects are able to. And so we're very excited to have this opportunity in Portland Harbor and that these restoration bankers have been able to make this type of prospective restoration work. Another aspect of what these banks are doing is that while so far we've negotiated and we've worked with them to make sure that they're able to meet the natural resource damage assessment goals that we have, they may be designed to provide other purposes, other types of credits that other regulators or other agencies might require. So Endangered Species Act conservation credits or Clean Water Act mitigation credits are other forms of credits that these banks are pursuing to be able to market their credits and make sure that the full ecological value of their project is recognized through one market or another. And so this final point on here, just like I was saying, restoration banking supports larger restoration projects, resulting in more integrated and self-sustaining habitats, which we're very excited to see. And one of the questions, another question that I think Michael had shared with me prior to the meeting tonight was a question around kind of where smaller sites might fit into this picture. And so, I did want to share and make sure to focus here on the fact that these banks are intended to pool the potential liability of multiple parties and to provide, these larger projects provide more self-sustaining habitats in that way. And we're very excited to see that. It doesn't mean that in the future, in future phases of the natural resource damage assessment or for other purposes, that smaller projects on smaller disconnected sites might not happen. I mean, they could still happen, particularly if an individual potentially responsible party wants to come to the trustee council and offer that type of a project to us to settle their liability. But at this point in time, given where we are in our natural resource damage assessment, and given that we have this opportunity to support these large restoration banks, that is the preferred alternative that the trustee council has selected. Some more of the benefits of restoration banks that I wanted to highlight, these are mainly ways in which they are meeting the monitoring and stewardship framework that we outlined in the trustee council's programmatic restoration plan. But so these restoration banks have committed to a 10-year performance period around their projects. So 10 years of very active monitoring and adaptive management after implementation. The restoration banks are also providing financial assurances for construction, monitoring, management, and other essential project functions, so that if something happened, you know, their business goes under, or we're having major disagreements around how the project is managed, or, you know, some sort of a problem, there are actually financial assurances that we can call upon to make sure that construction and monitoring and management go on as they committed to and as we agreed to. These projects have also established long-term stewardship budgets that are meant to make sure that the projects can be cared for in perpetuity. So those stewardship budgets are things that they are funding as they sell credits, but we have agreements with the project developers to make sure that those stewardship budgets are fully funded by the end of their 10-year performance period. And we intend, as we get closer to the end of that 10-year performance period, to start working more with the community and issue an RFP to identify an organization that will perform stewardship on these projects long term. We're not quite there yet, but it's something that we're really looking forward to engaging with stewardship organizations more about in the future. These restoration bank projects are also held to what we call credit release schedules. So the amount of credit that we hope their project will ultimately provide is not given to them all at once to be able to go out and sell. There are certain milestones that their projects have to achieve in order for credits to be released for them to go and sell to potentially responsible parties. And another just big benefit that we're very happy to see with these projects, as you'll see when I get into some of the graphics and can show you some maps of the projects, are that there are a combination of high priority habitat types that the sites are restoring to address the needs of multiple injured species. So they're doing things like adding large wood to channels to provide, you know, cover for salmonids, but also providing snags for bald eagles, and also providing you know, downed wood and riparian areas for mink to have shelter. So there's a combination of habitat types and habitat features that are being implemented to address the needs of the many species and many services that we're interested in restoring. So I was gonna then just walk through some more specifics about each of the restoration projects, just to help orient people a little more to what's happening at each of these 4 sites that have moved forward thus far. For those of you who've seen me give these presentations, within the trustee council, we try to get in front of the community advisory group about once a year and provide updates. So some of this might look familiar, especially about the Alder Creek project, because this project was implemented back in 2014, 2015, and 2016. So we've been coming and sharing updates and information with you for a couple of years now about this one. But this is a 52-acre site. It was the site of a former sawmill on the southern tip of Sauvie Island. This project has been implemented by Wildlands, that's the name of the company. And what they did was they removed buildings and other infrastructure that were on the site, some of which you can see in that before photo on the left-hand side of the screen. They also removed, I think, about 300,000 cubic yards of fill, mainly wood chips, from the floodplain. And by doing that, or in support of doing that, they then excavated these side channels that you can see in the after photo on the right-hand side. They also reshaped the riverbanks to have a more natural slope that is easier for salmon and other aquatic species to access and use, especially during high flows. They planted native trees, shrubs, and grasses, created shallow water habitat that flows through the site, and restored beach and wetland habitats. And the before and after photos, I think, show, paint a pretty good picture of what they did at the site. But here is just a graphic of their restoration design to sort of help see where those habitat types are and how the channels were placed on the site. The site also includes, in these darker green colors in the upper left-hand corner, oak and cottonwood woodland areas that were also restored with native plants. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the Linton Plywood Mill. So this is another former plywood or former mill site, a plywood mill site. It's a 26-acre project area. The project was implemented by a company called RestoreCap, and construction was completed in 2017 and 2018. Somewhat similar to the Alder Creek example, these guys removed numerous buildings, including the old mill building that you can see in the top right of that before photo. They also removed numerous pilings, several docks, and a good bit of riprap from the shoreline. They created off-channel habitat in this sort of horseshoe shape that you can see in the after illustration, and daylighted a part of Linton Creek that pours out onto the site from an outfall, pretty much right in the center of the site. Also planted native trees, shrubs, and grasses, and they are in the process of building a viewing platform and path for recreational use on the north end of the site, which, if you can see my arrow, there's sort of a gray line you can see towards the top of this after illustration, and that's where the recreational path is going. This after photo is not a photo, it's an illustration, a rendering that was developed by a graphic designer to demonstrate what the site will hopefully ultimately look like. And here again is just a map that shows some of the different habitat types and features, in case looking straight on it is a little bit more easier for folks. This kind of periwinkle colored area is the off-channel habitat. The blue line is the Linton Creek area that's daylighted and then runs through the off-channel habitat out to the Linton River. The PGE Harborton site is the most recent one to go to implementation. It was constructed just this past summer, and is still actually partly under construction. They're finishing up their native plantings right now. But this is a 53-acre restoration project. The project implementer is Portland General Electric, and Portland General Electric is a potentially responsible party within the Superfund site, but they have chosen to build this very large project that they believe is the amount of credit it will produce is much more than what they are liable for in Portland Harbor. And so they also intend to sell credits to other potentially responsible parties or to the trustee council, given all the extra value that this project is creating. And so the restoration here involves preserving natural areas on the site for salmon, and there's a wetland in the kind of northwestern corner of the site that provides really important habitat for northern red-legged frogs and other species. So preservation of existing habitats is a big part of this restoration concept and design. They've also removed about 154,000 cubic yards of dredge from the floodplain. They've excavated a tributary channel through the site. If you look at the after, actually at either of these visuals, you can see a tributary kind of carving right through the center of the site that was newly excavated. That's where some of that fill removal occurred. Within that channel, they've installed around 360 large wood pieces, and they're planting about 84,000 native plants across the site. And again, here's a kind of a, looking straight above at the site, you can see that tributary being excavated through the middle. Another piece of this project that you can see in the gray rectangle is that PGE maintains a substation. They still have some electrical infrastructure on the site, and so they've reduced the size of that substation to make more room for habitat as part of this project. And then the last project that has already been implemented is the Rynearson Creek Natural Area. So this is a 33-acre project site, and it's located on a combination of private lands and local government, City of Gladstone land, including part of Meldrum Bar Park down in Gladstone. The project implementer is a company called Columbia Restoration Group, and they built this project in 2017 and 2018. The main restoration components were removing an earthen dam that created a large pond on the site. The dam was removed, but a grade control structure remained. So now there's a smaller pond in place that continues to provide important habitat for native turtles. They also reshaped the stream banks, restored the native plant community. There's a lot of existing vegetation on that site, so there's a combination of new plantings and invasive plant removal going on. And then the site was also enhanced by adding large woody debris and rock piles and snags for benefit of many different fish and wildlife species. And so this site, I did want to highlight another question that Michael had kind of fed me before tonight's presentation was asking to clarify what level of public access is available on these different sites. And so Meldrum Bar Park is a public park that is open to anyone, and there is a trail on the north side of the park that goes through much of this restoration area and includes a little overlook where you can see some of the stream habitat. So this is an example of one of the sites where public access is available. There's other features outside of the restoration project itself that also allow for public access very close by. There's a boat ramp and other features at Meldrum Bar Park. Then the Linton project, like I mentioned, there is a recreational path that's being installed there currently. The other two sites, though, PGE and the Alder Creek project, are only they're privately owned, and there is no recreational access planned for them. You can, boat near them or close to them in order to kind of see the habitat from the water, but there are no paths or trails or public access planned to those other two sites. And here is just another, shot at the project design for this Rynearson natural area, where you can see the pond size that was reduced, kind of where this grade control structure was installed, and generally the footprint of the restoration area that's surrounded by this red outline. There was one other thing that I meant to address earlier, which was another question that Michael had sort of flagged for me that there's interest in. And I cannot see the questions that may have been coming in while I've been presenting thus far, but maybe just to get this one out of the way in case it's in the list. There's been a lot of question about how we coordinate between the natural resource damage assessment and the cleanup. And the trustee council and individual trustees do coordinate with EPA and DEQ. We've coordinated with them on these individual restoration projects as they've moved forward. Sometimes there has been residual contamination that we need to talk about that's addressed during the restoration construction. Sometimes there's a adjacent or nearby remedy that's being implemented or is planned that we want to make sure we're coordinated on. So we are doing those sorts of things along the way. But the trustee council as a whole does not coordinate as a group with EPA and DEQ on the cleanup. Individual trustees do that, as needed and as desired. And there are a couple of topics that have come up over the years where there has been some kind of larger trustee council coordination around some things like riverbanks guidance that EPA came out with some years ago. But mainly that coordination around individual sites is happening between individual trustees and EPA and DEQ. And so, another example that comes up a lot is Willamette Cove. And, we're very aware and know that Willamette Cove is a site that's of immense public interest. If you look through our ecological restoration portfolio, you'll see that Willamette Cove was identified there as a restoration, potential restoration project that we thought could meet some of the needs of the species and the services that we're most focused on restoring. But as that project moves forward, it's not a natural resource damage assessment project. It's not proposed as one, to the trustee council. And so while individual trustees may weigh in with specific, questions, comments, feedback around that whole process, the trustee council as a whole is not engaged in that particular project and that particular remedy. I will say that, I personally, in leading the restoration committee and in doing outreach like this for the trustee council, I do appreciate coordinating and trying to stay up to date on the different things that are happening with different remedial sites. There's a lot happening, so it's much more than I am single-handedly able to stay caught up with. But with the Willamette Cove example in particular, I have had a recent conversation with Katie Weil over at Metro about that project and about whether or not, based on my role here with NOAA, there might be some, technical assistance or just coordination we can do around as they think through what restoration there could be integrated with the cleanup. If there's things we've learned from these sites we've been working on with the trustee council that might be able to be applied, that sort of thing. I think another question was about kind of how we're coordinating with other, local and city governments. We have been, I had a similar conversation with Caitlin Lovell over at the City of Portland recently to kind of understand what they're looking at with some of their restoration projects in the near future. But, through the natural resource damage assessment, we have a very particular charge and very particular abilities under the law on what we're doing. And thus far, we feel, pretty happy to see that these restoration bank projects have been able to move forward and achieve meaningful restoration on the landscape ahead of any settlements. So, I'm not sure that I've made that point yet, but the trustee council, given that we hope we're very close to the end of phase 2 of our natural resource damage assessment process, we still don't actually have any settlements with potentially responsible parties. We hope that's going to change very soon, but we don't have funding in hand that we're working with to get out there and do restoration. And these restoration bank projects have thus far all been implemented prospectively by the restoration bankers themselves, which we're very excited to see happen and think is a very good thing for the lower Willamette River and for the species that have been injured by contamination in Portland Harbor. But so I did just want to reemphasize that point, and also the point that this is just one, this is phase 2 of our natural resource damage assessment. And like we talk about a bit in the supplemental restoration plan in EA, what we've decided to do thus far in recognizing credits from these restoration banks only applies to phase 2 of our process. There will be future phases of the natural resource damage assessment, and those future phases may open up doors for other means of restoration and other restoration projects to happen in the future. But hopefully diving into these 4 sites a little bit has been helpful. I think that was my last slide there. So I'm happy to answer now more questions. And I think Michael had hoped we had about 15 minutes or so that we could set aside for that. I did just want to share here, this website is the Trustee Council's website, where there is a ton of information on the work that we're doing. Also, fact sheets and newsletters and lots of ways that we try to get the information about Portland Harbor natural resource damage assessment and restoration out there in a way that's accessible and hopefully interesting to you all. And of course, also here's my contact information if anyone is interested in following up after tonight.
Okay, Lauren, thank you so much. That was great. That was really great. Super grateful that you were here to present to us. So Dana, Scott, I think you guys were tracking questions in the chat. Do we want to?
Yeah, Dana's going to be in charge of this portion.
Okay. let's go ahead and
Okay,
tackle some of our questions here, and then we'll see if there's anyone that wants to ask any vocal ones.
Okay, perfect. So one of the questions is, Laura, does restoration include daylighting creek for the Willamette? You gave one example of that, so I think that should be an easy answer.
Yeah, in the example of the Linton project, that's part of what they did at that site. And if you look through the ecological restoration portfolio, I can't remember off the top of my mind, there's 44 projects in there, and it's been a little while since I've looked at some of them, but the concept of daylighting creeks that flow into the Willamette is definitely in multiple project concepts that are included in there. So yeah, it's happening at least one of the sites that has been implemented thus far, and it's a type of restoration that we imagine can happen at other places, whether through the natural resource damage assessment or through other ways that restoration gets implemented in the Lower Willamette.
Okay, that was a question I think a lot of people wanted to ask by Doris Weller. There's a lot of questions around the buying or the tearing down of the Rester Cap, demolishing the plywood mill building after community groups thought they agreed to keep it. And we've heard that they're not going to let the community buy it because it's going to cost too much. So could you talk about that a little bit?
I maybe can, but probably not a ton. I mean, the issue there around that mill building is really for Restore Cap as the landowner at that site to resolve. I had long been under the impression that they did intend to give or sell the mill building over to the community for a research and education center that I know there's long been interest in. Unfortunately, that aspect of the site is outside of the ecological restoration, goals and agreement that we have with them. I can say, at least at this point, that mill building has not been destroyed. The mill building has, but not the office building that I know the community's interested in. And so my understanding thus far has been that door is still open, but that Restore Cap has just been looking to sell it. I'm probably not the most up to date on that. I know John Shaw and others that probably have far more up to date information than I do. But again, that's that building and its future uses are kind of outside of the scope of what the trustee council has agreement with that project developer on.
Okay, so that sounds really good. I think Sarah maybe would want to address that. She sounds like she has something she wants to say. So Sarah, if you want to unmute yourself and make a comment.
Sarah, did you want to unmute and comment?
Yeah, I think, am I good now? I think the thing that concerns me is that was kind of, as a Linton Neighborhood Association person, was the first project that we went through, and people came to the meetings and we listened. And I think I just hope that doesn't happen with any other site, as moving forward, that really, they came and they definitely said, because I think we said we wanted to not have the mill building be a part of the project. I mean, I think we said we don't want Restore Cap to buy something if they're just going to use it as a real estate investment, and they're selling it for a lot of money. And so it does feel like they came and didn't speak truthfully to us. So I think it's leaving a bad taste in people's mouths about Restore Cap. And I think that there's other sites that are going to come up, and the access, I know we're getting the trail, but the access, the building that didn't need to be part of that project, like they never should have gotten the building. If it wasn't part of the project, I don't know why they were given real estate to make money on. that had nothing to do with the project. And unfortunately, you're separate from them, but you know, you presented it to us. So, I mean, and then of course you also know that they made a mountain. You know, they didn't do the drawings the way, they didn't build the project out the way it was presented to the community. So I would just say that I think everybody's happy the project happened, but I would just say there's a lot of red flags about what happened with that project, and not really being clear with their community at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sarah. I do understand where you guys are coming from. And I was at some of those meetings where I heard some of those same commitments made. So I am also surprised by some of the change of plans that have occurred. I don't know. I do wonder if maybe a future conversation like this where we include RestorCap might be a more appropriate place to dig into the details, just because I really can't speak for their plans and intentions and motivations and what all is occurring there, unfortunately. But I hear you, and I appreciate you sharing those observations and comments.
That leads us to another question, and it says, what, oh, where is it? So it has the stewardship in perpetuity, you know, going forward. Who actually has responsibility for that stewardship, and what are the communities? How do we know that that's just not going to be absorbed after 25 or 50 years by some government agency, and because somebody's tired of paying it and they would rather use the money a certain way? So since we know that things can change, like the RestorCap idea, how do we know that that stewardship is going to, budgets are going to be safe?
Yeah, you know, and this stewardship piece is one that I'm, I guess just as a little bit of a side note, that I'm hoping over the coming year or so to document in some ways, like with a fact sheet or brochure, or maybe a presentation focused just on the stewardship question, because I think there are so many details and so many questions around it. So it's something that I hope to be doing more and better outreach about with you all and others over, you know, in the future. But, you know, I will just share that the long-term stewardship of restoration projects is something that the trustee council is prioritizing and takes very seriously, and recognizes does not always occur and has not always occurred in natural resource damage assessments. But as we all see with, you know, invasive species and land use issues and so many things, active management is needed over the long term to make sure that conservation areas continue to meet their conservation goals 10, 20, 30, 100 years in the future. So that it's something that is, you know, I would say somewhat new to the natural resource damage assessment world. Within NOAA, we have a policy that's probably only about 5 years old that really requires us to integrate stewardship into our restoration planning for natural resource damage assessment projects. And, you know, especially given the 5 tribes that are engaged with this trustee council, it's a thing that is of particular importance to the Portland Harbor Natural Resource Trustee Council. Our hope and our plan is to pool the funding from these 4 restoration projects into a single, into management by a single stewardship entity that will perform long-term stewardship across all the projects. And that's where we will be issuing an RFP in the coming years and looking to a local organization that does stewardship as their kind of bread and butter, their main, you know, role in the Lower Willamette area. There's a lot of organizations out there that do that, like Columbia Restoration, or I'm sorry, you know, the Wetlands Conservancy, and you know, multiple conservation organizations that are out there that do stewardship long term. So we're hoping it's going to be an organization like that that performs that role. And the funding is you know, set aside for that purpose. And so to me, it seems unlikely that that a government agency or some other thing could happen with those funds ultimately, because they're really earmarked for stewardship long term. But building out that program and working with the community to make sure that it exists and is built up in the right ways, that's something that we're going to be working on over the coming years. And that, like I said, I hope to be coming and having more detailed conversations with you all about in the future.
Okay, fantastic. And then there's really two more questions that are kind of burning. Is this one is for Arena Phillips. Is how many credits are issued by now?
How many credits are issued right now? Like how many credits has the trustee council released, I think is what that question is asking. I don't have that number in my head. But I will say that there are, credits that have been released from the Alder, the Winton, and the Rainierson projects. The PGE project has not yet had any credits released. Across those three projects, the total might be something like 500 or so. I'd have to go back and look, so please don't quote that number, but if that helps to give kind of a scale, that's around where I think we're at across those three projects that have had credit releases.
Okay, and then another question was, you said that early on, like many years ago, you did research with experts on defining the projects, etc. Is that research available to be, so we can see what people thought was important and some of the science behind it? That would be of very interest to people.
Yeah, would you guys mind if I share my screen again and I can show you all where you could find some of that on our website? Would that be, I mean, I could say it's on our website, but I could also point you to some of the specifics if that's helpful. Let me try this new share.
She wants to skip.
Okay.
There you go.
Do you see my screen again and see a website?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the Portland Harbor Trustee Council's main website. If you go to the restoration planning section and scroll down, under restoration planning, you can find a whole bunch of things that might be of interest. I saw another question come up in the chat about where our programmatic and supplemental restoration plans might be available. The programmatic restoration plan is here under our NEPA documents, and very soon the supplemental restoration plan is going to be up in this section as well. But in this restoration planning section, there is this expert panel cover letter to the literature review and a juvenile spring Chinook literature review. And those two pieces are really the two primary products we have from that expert panel process. And they have a lot of really awesome information. I've gone back to them kind of year after year for just kind of understanding exactly what the expert panel informed us about geographic priorities, habitat types that are most important to juvenile salmonids, that sort of thing. So those are the two main documents that I would point folks towards. And just while we're looking at it, this revised ecological restoration portfolio just above is the list of 44 projects that I was showing a map of earlier.
Okay, well, thanks for all those great questions. I know we have more questions too in the chat. So Lauren, do you think you can hang out with us for a little bit, maybe after our presenters, and we can maybe jump to some of these questions here? Dana, if you could kind of log those questions so that we can ask Lauren of those after we get through with Dave's presentation. And we do have a very quick, very brief presentation by Howard Sprouse at the end of the meeting. It's going to be very, very short, but he wants to kind of give everyone get everyone up to date on what is happening with the bench test for the bioremediation project at Willamette Cove. So I know this is a lot tonight, but it all kind of, when it's good, it's really good, and it all just kind of came in today. So so without any more waiting, we're going to go ahead and bring on David Hauser, who's terrestrial biologist and technical service group for the Bureau of Environmental Services. So David, we're going to go ahead and bring you on and have you share your information. And Lauren, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. It's so informative. Thank you.
Unopened.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. So my name's Dave Helzer, and I'm a biologist with the City of Portland Environmental Services. And I was asked to come tonight and talk a little bit with this group about some work on the Columbia Slough. In general, I work on wildlife and wildlife habitat, wetlands, and salmon habitat across the city for environmental services. And I did focus on the Columbia Slough for a little while. So I'm going to highlight some of those projects that I was asked to talk about this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, PowerPoint. Does that look good?
So we don't have it in your presentation mode. We just have all of the
Any dinner?
all of the slides there.
Thank you.
And
Oh, really?
and if we see all of the slides. And if folks could mute their microphones so that we only hear the presenter, that would be great. I'm gonna try that one more time there, Dave.
Sure.
So yeah, we were able to see, we could just see all of the slides instead of just one.
Okay, I'm going to try this again.
Okay, and I think you may have to hit presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
It's being a little slow for me. You still just seeing the slide view of like the group of slides?
Yeah, it's
bigger
just a group.
view. Yeah.
Hmm.
Go ahead and just click on one slide and see if you can open it up and make it bigger. May not be optimal, but.
Okay. Yeah.
Dave, do you have a second screen open, perhaps?
Yeah, I do.
I think you may be sharing the wrong screen. We're seeing perhaps your other screen.
Yeah, okay. Just give me a second here. Used to doing this in a different program.
There we go.
Looks
Yeah,
great.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that working?
Yeah, it will do. We can see the slide for sure. Yeah.
Michael, can you see just like maybe just the,
Yeah, we can see we can see the main presentation. It's pretty clear. Yeah, so I think if you wanted to just scroll through it the way that it is now, that'll work just fine.
okay, I apologize for that. I haven't had this
Oh.
problem before, of course, when I'm in a big group of folks that don't know me. So
You're fine.
thanks for bearing with me.
It looks good, David. Don't worry.
Okay. So yeah, so I was asked to come and talk about some projects tonight in the Columbia Slough, and I think part of what I talked about with Michael, and after listening to all the great information that Lauren shared, there might part of the context here is maybe looking at some slightly smaller projects in comparison to some of those restoration banks that have been developed under the NERDA program, those larger sites in the 50-acre range. So I just switched to the second slide. Can you see that?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna try to keep this to about 15 minutes. I know we have a lot of stuff on the agenda here. So this, and you can see, can you see my cursor here moving?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. So this is a map of, sort of part of the Portland Harbor, the northern part. And this right here is the Columbia Slough, the sort of ribbon of green running between St. John's and the Columbia River floodplain and the Columbia River. And so all the projects that I'm kind of hitting on tonight, I'm just going to give you kind of a quick summary of several projects are in the Columbia Slough. And they're represented by these 5 fish icons. And I'm going to talk about four projects across these 5 areas. Just in general, the first person who spoke tonight, Sarah Taylor, provided some great historical context, which is a perfect setup for this topic, and Lauren also hit on some of it too, about the historic condition out here. The Columbia Slough itself is really best thought of as a side channel of the Columbia River. Although it meets the Willamette River right here at the downstream end of the Columbia Slough and drains into the Willamette River, it's really a side channel of the Columbia River, much like Multnomah Channel is. Multnomah Channel kind of starts here and then rejoins Sauvie Island, goes around Sauvie Island and rejoins the Columbia River further downstream. So the Columbia Slough parallels, continues off this map and parallels the Columbia River channel all the way up to Fairview Lake in the Troutdale area. It's a low energy environment. It's a tidal slough environment. It is open to the Willamette River all along what's visible here in this aerial photograph, and a little bit off the map around the vicinity of Northeast 18th Avenue, somewhat near the west end of Portland Airport, is the first federal levee. And that's where the slough, Columbia Slough, is disconnected from tidal influence, and there's no access for salmon. So when I talk about the lower slough, I'm talking about the area that's downstream of that first federal levee. There were some questions that Michael mentioned, and Sarah Taylor showed a map, and so did Lauren, that kind of showed what the historic condition out here. And one of the questions was like, what's the connection between the slough and the Willamette? And some of those historic map images showed this whole area, especially in here, as a complex of sloughs, wetlands, and lakes. And I just want to make note, especially of this area, which is currently the Rivergate Industrial Area, which showed on some of the maps earlier tonight as just a gigantic open lake wetland area, much like Smith and Bybee Lakes, but that actually connected to the lower Columbia Slough instead of the Willamette River. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects tonight. BES. BES is the acronym for Bureau of Environmental Services, by the way, City of Portland. I'm going to talk about 3 projects tonight, plus a bonus project that isn't a BES project. The drivers for these projects that these have all been completed. The newest one was completed in 2015. The drivers include the City of Portland's response to the Endangered Species Act listing of many different species of salmon in our region. And some of the work also relates to our goals around temperature management along the Columbia Slough and increasing shade. And the lower slough in general is identified in the Endangered Species Act Federal Recovery Plan for salmon in the lower Columbia. So I'm going to talk about these 3 projects that are listed here. A lot of studies and plans have been developed along the Columbia Slough, and one consistent finding was that there was a lack of in-stream cover in the Columbia Slough. Wood has been systematically removed from our rivers and around the region, and the Columbia Slough is suffering from a lack of in-stream cover, which is also called refugia in the context of salmon. So these projects aim to reestablish that cover, as well as reconnect floodplains. There's very little riparian zones. Because of levees and because of industrial development, a lot of the banks of the slough are devoid of trees. So there's not only has the wood been removed, but there's not a lot of trees that exist to fall into the slough. So those are some of the deficiencies that these projects aim to address. There's a little picture here on the life cycle of salmon, which I'm sure many folks are familiar with living in the Northwest. Starting over here with eggs, these are laid in rivers across the region, and the young fish hatch out and begin their outward migration here as fry and parr. And so when we talk about salmon in the lower Columbia Slough, we're really talking about these juvenile fish that are on their outbound migration to the ocean for the first time. They're working their way down from the higher elevation rivers. They're coming into the lower Columbia, lower Willamette River area, and they're seeking out sheltered areas, especially to shelter from predators. As they continue downstream, they'll begin their smoltification process when they start to hit that salt water further down the Columbia River. But when they're making their first migration through the Portland region, they're really looking for quiet areas to get out of the velocities in the bigger rivers and escape from predators. These are some of the fish that we've, juvenile salmon that we've sampled in the lower Columbia Slough. These are the 3 species that we really think of as being mostly occurring there in the lower Columbia Slough, and these are all juveniles. And these fish are originating from both the Willamette Basin and the Columbia Basin. So some genetic work has shown that these fish are coming from as far away as like the Methow River in northern Washington, and also as far south as maybe the Santa Am River in the Willamette watershed. There's no spawning no spawning habitat in the lower Columbia Slough, so we're not going to really see a lot of adults going up there to spawn. It's really just the juveniles. There's also brook lamprey and Pacific lamprey in the lower Columbia Slough. And this Columbia Slough is also critical habitat, I believe specifically for coho. Endangered species designated critical habitat under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So I'm going to touch on 4 projects that have been completed in the lower Columbia Slough for restoration that BES, City of Portland Environmental Services, has completed. The first one is called the Columbia Slough Confluence Project, and it's right at the mouth of the slough, where the slough meets the Willamette River. So in the photograph on the left, you're looking out towards the Willamette River from the Columbia Slough at its confluence, and so the land in the horizon is the south end of Sovey Island. And that's the Willamette main stem channel there. So the objective of this project was to place engineered log jams along the shoreline of the Columbia Slough in this area. This is the right bank here is Kelly Point Park. And so because we know wood is missing from our waterways and especially the lower Columbia Slough, and we know that these young fish need wood to escape velocities, they need to hide from predators. We know that by putting wood in, we're hoping to increase the chance that more of these juvenile fish will survive their outward migration to the Columbia Ocean, through the Columbia to the Pacific Ocean. So really this type of project, this wood placement is really about reestablishing physical habitat that's lacking. Lauren talked about reestablishing processes too, like ecological processes in the aquatic ecosystem. This particular project might jumpstart some wood catchment and wood recruitment, and that's especially true in salmon habitat restoration that's done in sort of traditional or classic riverine systems where these wood structures can help jumpstart ecological processes and sort of build habitat and sustain habitat and catch more wood and create gravel bars and scours and pools. Here it's more just about getting the structure in place and providing it for fish. There might be a little bit of additional wood racking up, but there's not a lot of wood in the system to begin with. So this project was completed several years ago. It was a boat-based construction. And you can see these little miniature tugboats in the photograph on the right. The engineered log jams had 4 logs each. They were assembled in a staging area and then floated into place and anchored along the bank or shoreline of the Columbia Slough. And this project cost a little less than $500,000. And the goal was really to make the slough more hospitable, especially for fish that are just entering the slough from the river. The next project is a little bit further upstream. So I'm taking you from the mouth of the slough and we're going upstream or south. Now the slough is tidal, so it flows both ways. So saying upstream is not necessarily the best way to say it, but we're going up the slough. This is a Port of Portland site that I just wanted to kind of highlight because I think it's a good example of the type of work that can be done with a small footprint, but can add a lot of ecological benefit, even if it's at a small scale. This is a Port of Portland mitigation site along Columbia Slough. And so what they did here was excavate out this area, which was high ground, and make a connection here with the slough and bring the slough into some newly created shallow sort of wetland swale type features. And so this adds new habitat area, you know, probably about 5 acres, I would say, I would estimate this site is. But it adds new area, whereas the last project I talked about just added wood to an existing channel. This actually adds new habitat to the slough system. And it introduces a process that allows for the establishment of seasonal wetland hydrology. Right now, the slough is not really flowing in here. This is probably late in the summer, but there's these gradual slopes through here that are seasonally inundated. And because they are seasonally inundated, they allow for the establishment of wetland plant communities, which provide habitat for lots of different species of wildlife, including young fish who are looking out for places to hide. This is a picture of the same site in higher water, so you can see it does fill up. Pretty constrained site, but still providing a lot of ecological function at a small scale. The next site is back to City of Portland Environmental Services sites. This is the earliest of these projects I'm talking about. This is called the Ramsey Lake Refugia project. And as I was starting out and showing that overview map, I mentioned the historic Ramsey Lake that if you knew where to look for it, it was featured in some of those earlier maps that were shown. And so this project aimed to restore a very, very, very small fraction of the historic Ramsey Lake wetland complex. This is a photograph, an aerial photograph after the project had been completed. Before the project, if you could imagine, this was just a slough bank here. And this channel didn't exist. And there was a roadway and then fill below that. And through research, BES was able to determine that this location, in fact, based on the historic mapping and aerial photography, was where the Ramsey Lake complex, which was probably at least 1,000 acres, connected to the lower Columbia Slough. And so it had been filled and disconnected. So this removed that fill and reestablished this connection and excavated this alcove and this back channel, which is a very gradual slope going back this way. Of course, the historic lake would have extended far to the west off this map. But what this project did was included placement of large wood and this nice gradual slope that was reintroduced as both seasonal flows and tidal fluctuations was able to reestablish seasonal wetland hydrology, which then supports new plant communities being established, wetland plant communities. And one of the really cool things that happened on this site was we had a very strong response from a native plant called wapato. It came back within a year because the hydrology was just right for it. And this had all been upland area before. And in this part of the project, there's a thriving patch of wapato now. And this site is about 10 acres. If you look carefully, you can see some light colored patches along the Columbia Slough here. There's one here, there's one here, and there's one here. And these are from a later project, actually what's the most recent project along the Columbia Slough. And if you can imagine you're standing right here, this is what you would see. This is that log jam. And this down here is one of the ones you could also see in the aerial. So this is just a view looking across that connection that was reopened between the Ramsey Lake area and the Columbia Slough on the Ramsey Lake project. And then later we came in and added additional engineered log jams to the lower Columbia Slough. And this was one of the locations we added those. This photograph was taken probably in like July or August, I would think. And it's low water. And so the alcove is not inundated, but it has a nice exposed mud flat. There's a lot of places on the lower Columbia Slough where these mud flats are exposed in the late summer and are used by migratory birds, especially sandpipers that are coming down off the Arctic in the late summer. And so we really seek a multi-species benefit from this because this established new mud flats in the Columbia Slough as well, new seasonal mud flats. So the last project is about these log jams, which are much bigger than the first set I showed you up at the mouth of the slough, which were an earlier project. These are, this project was completed in 2015. And this project just placed log jams along the main stem of Columbia Slough in 2 locations. And the log jams contain up to about 30 logs. And this is just a schematic showing what they look like from the plan view and the cross-section view. We used, again, for this log placement project, a water-based construction method, which is really beneficial because it reduces impacts on the banks. There's so little riparian habitat on the banks of the slough. One of the last things we want to do is bring in equipment and cut roads through it and drive through it and have a big impact. So this project utilizes 2 barges, one for the excavator and then one for materials to build these structures. So we place these structures around Wright and Moore Islands near PIR, about 25 of them, as well as in a lower area of the slough near the Ramsey spot I was just showing you. And so that was about that was completed in 2015 and was about a $2 million project. project with some grant funding as well. And so, you know, again, the goal here is to provide cover for juvenile fish that are coming into the slough. We know it's lacking. We know they need it. We hope that these projects will help more fish survive their first outward migration to the Pacific Ocean. So that's kind of a high level of some projects. And I want to go ahead and answer some questions and make time for the rest of your meeting here.
Thank you for that, David. It looks as though we have one question. So Dana, if you want to do that, and maybe we can do one voice question before we go ahead and save a little bit of space for Howard to present to us real quick.
Okay, this is from the Portland Harbor Community Coalition, and it's what contamination remains in the Columbia Slough? How does it affect the city's restoration?
That's a good question. I can speak about that in really general terms, but I'm not the technical expert at all on that. So I can follow up with Michael and provide a little bit more information on that. But I can just say in really general terms that a lot of partner agencies are working to clean up historic contamination in the sediment in Columbia Slough. One of the elements of designing these projects and planning them was thinking about where known contaminating areas are and working to not disturb the sediment, because that can release the contaminants back into the waterway. So we're pretty cognizant of that. There was, I think it's Pacific Carbide was near the Wright and Moore Island log placement. So we coordinated pretty closely with DEQ on that. And I understand that project's going to remediation. Don't quote me on that. But it's mostly about avoiding disturbing sediments when we're planning this work, because these structures are anchored. So you need to anchor them to keep them in place. So there's anchoring that goes into the bed of the slough.
Okay. All right. So is there anyone that has a question for David? If you want to unmute and ask your question, here's your opportunity. Okay. So with that, then let's go ahead and move on to Howard Sprouse. Howard, are you here? If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hello. Hi,
All
everybody.
right.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we sure can. So
Yeah,
we'll go ahead and have your slide put up, and then we'll let you go on into it and give us an update on what's going on with the bioremediation at Willamette Cove.
absolutely. Mine's going to be really easy, you guys, because my PowerPoint just has one slide. So this shouldn't take much time at all. Anyway, hello to everybody from the Community Advisory Group and Metro and Port of Portland. And what I'd like to do is give you all a short update on our project with the bench remediation trial. And then for those of you that don't know about this, what this is about is that we have been working down at Willamette Cove with some soil down there, and we have it up at our laboratory in Port Gamble, Washington. It's a toxicology lab up there, and we have a room that the remediators, my company, has. And we are working with that soil in a study using the integrated biological approach of remediation, which includes mycoremediation, which is my main area of expertise, phytoremediation, and the use of endophytic microbes. And I'm working with Intrinsics Environmental out of NASA Ames Research Park in California that have supplied the phytoremediation plants and the microbes, and then the fungi is something that we work with. Anyway, on this one slide, I took this photo this afternoon, and this picture is of our room and the project that we have going on. You can see the plants in the pots, and inside of each of those pots is a little over a gallon of soil from Willamette Cove, and there are 3 different strains of fungi in there. And then these are hybrid poplars that have been treated with microbes, and so they have a suite of bacteria that is growing inside of them. And right now we're at month number 3 of what is going to be a 4-month trial, and so we're going to start breaking everything down on the 8th, the week of the 8th of next month. The soil is going to get sent back down to Portland. I'm going to take it down rather. Some of it will go to the Superfund Research Center at Oregon State, where it'll be subjected to a study, toxicology study using Gambusa fish, which are, if you've seen them before, those are the small clear fish that you can see all of their organs inside of them, and they are highly sensitive to variables in the environmental conditions, and particularly toxins that they may get exposed to. Anyway, tonight was really interesting for us to hear about the projects that you have going on down there. I'd love to learn more about that and network with some of you. And I'd like to suggest that any of you that would like to learn more about our project that we have going on, this bench trial, which would be typical of the first phase that we would normally go through in doing remediation project like this. And we have projects like this down in California, in Oregon, in Washington, and up in Alaska. Anyway, if we have time for questions, I'm happy to answer some. Mostly, I would encourage you to reach out to the Community Action Group or to me directly. You can get my email off of the Community Action Group's website. Next week, we are going to be publishing a photographic essay of everything that we've done so far. So you're going to be able to see the process that starts out with the mixing of the materials, the additions of the plants, putting them into the room here, and then their care and maintenance. And so anyway, I've been real excited about this project. I hopefully it will go to a pilot. If we're successful with this, we're looking forward to that and would look forward to working with any of you in the future.
Oh, great. That's awesome. Howard, do you want your email in the chat, or I can
yeah,
have
I'll put my email in the chat right now.
Okay, all right. And
Okay.
also, folks, if you go to the CAG's YouTube page, there will be a video of Howard actually introducing the Port of Portland Metro and community members to his lab from December. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting video there. So if you want to know more what's happening up there in Port Gamble, that's great. So I know we're close on time. So if there are any additional questions that folks have for any of our presenters, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Don't be shy. And if Dana, if you want to maybe read off a couple of the questions from for Lauren, because I know that she needs to take care of a small one. So if you want to read off a couple of questions for her, then we'll go ahead and maybe call it a night after 2 questions for Lauren.
Okay. Let me see, am I unmuted? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the questions I was going to ask Michael is if we can collect some of these questions, maybe you could kind of send them to her and then we can report out
Totally.
maybe next month on
I
some of our
can.
answers. That might be a really good.
Yes,
So
we
one
can
of the
totally do that.
questions that Laura Feldman said is, would PG&E still be responsible for cleaning up the site it's responsible for?
Yeah, PG&E's liability for cleanup or for impacts to natural resources through the natural resource damage assessment process, that's not impacted by the fact that they are implementing a restoration banking project. So they still have that liability both for the cleanup and for the restoration.
Oh, that's a great clarification. I think that was really important for people to hear. Thank you. And then Elijah from the Portland Harbor Community Coalition asked, does NOAA or the Trustees Council have any strategies for integrating these kinds of conservation projects with existing and in-use industrial areas? And how would good local planning support the Trustee Council's broader restoration vision? And then thinking of the last river plan, which was blocked by the Land Use Board of Appeals because of conflicting land goals. So if you know anything about that, then that'd be great.
You know, that strikes me as a bigger conversation, and so I don't mean to punt, but I would maybe just offer that maybe we could follow up more on that conversation, Elijah. And I guess the only thought I would share at this point in time is that for a long time, and especially when we first started a lot of the restoration planning that the Trustee Council has done, 10 years ago or so, a lot of what we heard, especially from potentially responsible parties back then, was that that restoration was like an incompatible use or not something that was realistic to consider happening in Portland Harbor itself. And we've really found that not to be true. And, as you guys all know from working so closely on Portland Harbor, the whole stretch of the Superfund site is not uniformly contaminated. And there's large portions of it that are actually in relatively good shape. And then there are hot spots, and then there are areas where there's a whole, combination of contaminants. So, I think there's different sites within the harbor may call for and provide opportunity for really different types of uses. And, as others were commenting about the needs of salmon, for instance, and having resting places every so many miles, to the extent that we can try to accommodate those multiple uses in the harbor, we're really fortunate to have that opportunity in Portland. And I think these restoration projects are a testament to the fact that restoration is possible despite those ongoing uses. So I look forward to more conversation on that, and maybe to better understand some of where your question's coming from.
Yeah, I think that's really the last question. There might be more, but the groupings and stuff, but we can send that off to you, Lauren.
Yeah, we sure will. And we don't have a CAG meeting next month. There will be the collaborative meeting that we spoke of earlier this evening in place of the CAG meeting. And we'll be sending out an announcement about that next week. And we will be sending out a newsletter. So check the newsletter that we'll be sending out next week for some of those answers to the questions that we're going to send out to Lauren. If there's anything, any announcements, anything that anyone wants to share before we call it a night? Okay, it sounds like it's radio silence out there. So I'm going to say this is the end of our CAG meeting. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight and hanging in there. We know it's a long meeting. We've been getting out about 30 minutes earlier since we've been doing this virtual thing, but there's just so much good information out there. We had to share it with you. We will be seeing all of you really soon. take care of each other out there. Look out for one another. Stay safe and healthy. We want to see all of you guys in the same room in the near future. So be mindful that we all get through this together. Thanks a lot. Good night, everyone.
Michael.